How far would you go to find out the truth about the person you love? For Arthur Sterling, a man who had everything, the answer was to risk losing it all. His life was a masterpiece of opulence, a perfectly curated world of glass towers and pristine beaches. He owned it all: the private jets, the sprawling estates, the yachts shimmering in turquoise waters. He was a titan of industry, a man whose name was whispered in boardrooms across the globe. Yet despite the endless parade of luxury, there was an empty space in his heart, a cold, unsettling suspicion that shadowed his every step. Her name was Victoria. A supermodel of ethereal beauty, she was the final piece in his meticulously assembled life, the golden statue on the pedestal. Their engagement was the talk of the town, a fairy tale splashed across magazines and social media feeds. She played the part perfectly: the doting fiancée, the elegant companion, the woman who seemed to embody everything he believed he wanted. But beneath the polished veneer of their perfect romance, a tiny crack had formed. It was a fleeting glance she'd shared with his financial advisor, a question she'd asked about his will that was just a little too precise. A subtle hunger in her eyes that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with his fortune. Arthur had seen enough of the world to know that true loyalty was the rarest commodity of all. His past was littered with people who had used him, admired his wallet more than his character. He was tired of the game, tired of the charade, but he was in love, or at least he thought he was. And so he decided to do something no one would ever expect. He was going to set a trap, an elaborate test so cruel and so devastating that it would shatter the illusion and reveal the truth once and for all. He would trade his wealth for his worth, his fortune for his character. He would pretend to be a broken man to see if she would love him in pieces. He had a team, a secret circle of professionals he trusted implicitly, and he set his plan in motion. It was a plan of deception, of a staged fall from grace so complete, so convincing, that the world would believe he had lost everything. And in the midst of this manufactured ruin, he would wait for Victoria to show her true colors. He hoped, against all the evidence, that she would be different. He desperately wanted her to be the woman she pretended to be. But deep down he was prepared for the worst. For Arthur Sterling, this was not just a test. It was a final desperate gamble for his heart. Arthur's world was a silent, meticulously organized machine. His days began at 4 a.m., not with a blaring alarm, but with the gentle, rhythmic hum of his automated blinds opening to reveal the sprawling city below. There were no leisurely mornings, no slow sips of coffee. His routine was a cold, precise equation of data, market analysis, and strategic maneuvers. He was a general on the battlefield of global finance. His command center, a penthouse office with floor-to-ceiling windows. His conversations were with advisors who spoke in percentages and projections, with lawyers who navigated the murky waters of corporate law, and with bankers who managed fortunes in the blink of an eye. In this life, every interaction had a purpose, a bottom line. Victoria moved through this world like a beautiful ghost. She appeared for orchestrated dinners and charity galas, her hand resting gracefully on his arm, her smile a practiced curve of perfect teeth. They shared a luxurious bed, but he often felt more alone lying next to her than he did in his empty office at 2 a.m. Their dialogue was as polished as their surroundings. They spoke of designer clothes, vacation plans, and the guest list for their wedding. The words were beautiful, but they had no weight. They had no soul. In the quiet corners of his mansion, a different kind of life existed. This was the world of the staff, the unseen figures who kept the machine running. Among them was Maria, the head housekeeper. She was a woman of simple grace and quiet efficiency, her presence a soft, warm counterpoint to the sharp, cold edges of Arthur's reality. He would often see her, a fleeting figure in the background, her hands busy, her face serene. Once he'd dropped a pen in the hall, and without a word, she had retrieved it and handed it back to him, her eyes holding a silent, genuine kindness he hadn't seen directed at him in years. He had merely nodded and moved on, But the brief moment lingered, a faint echo in the otherwise empty halls of his heart. This was the life he had built, a life of flawless convenience and profound emptiness. He was admired, envied, but never truly known. He was a king in a kingdom built of sand, and he was about to command the tide to come in and wash it all away. The final straw wasn't a shocking revelation, but a quiet conversation over dinner. They were in the private dining room of a Michelin-starred restaurant, the air thick with the scent of truffles and old money. Victoria was, as always, an exquisite vision in silk and diamonds. But her words were blunt instruments, chipping away at the fragile edifice of their relationship. "Darling," she said, twirling her wineglass, "you're so focused on these new tech ventures. Have you given any thought to, well, solidifying our future? It's not morbid, it's just practical. A prenuptial agreement is one thing, but what about contingencies? Just in case?" Her eyes, so often filled with a polished sparkle, held a cold, analytical glint. She was calculating, not just their next move, but his. Arthur felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It wasn't the first time she had mentioned a contingency plan, but the casual, almost predatory way she spoke about his potential demise, as a mere inconvenience to her financial security, sent a wave of finality crashing over him. He saw it all then. The perfect smile was a mask, the tender touches were a performance, and the love she professed was nothing more than a carefully crafted lie. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking through him at the immense fortune that lay beyond his mortality. "Contingencies," Arthur repeated, his voice dangerously low. He watched her for a moment, a sudden clarity washing over him. The decision was no longer just an idea. It was a necessity. He had to know. He had to be sure. He had to tear down the entire fake reality to find out if there was any truth underneath. He excused himself, leaving her to her expensive meal and her cold calculations. He walked out of the restaurant and into the cool night air, pulling out his phone. His fingers moved with a surgeon's precision. "It's time," he said into the phone, his voice a low, firm command. "The plan goes live tomorrow. No exceptions, no second thoughts." On the other end, his trusted associate, the only person he had confided in, simply replied, "Understood, Mr. Sterling. The stage is set." Arthur ended the call. The city lights a blur of cold, indifferent color around him. The storm was coming, and he was the one who had just set it in motion. The plan went into motion with the silent, brutal efficiency of a perfectly timed thunderclap. Arthur was alone in his favorite sports car, a machine of incredible power, as he drove along a winding coastal road. The sun was a brilliant slash of fire across the horizon, painting the sky with impossible colors. He had arranged for the road to be closed, for the stage crash to be a private spectacle, witnessed only by the team he had trusted with his deception. He gripped the wheel, his knuckles white, and for the first time in a long time he felt a flicker of genuine fear. This wasn't just an act. It was a leap of faith into an unknown abyss. He swerved, the tires protesting with a high-pitched shriek, and the car careened into a series of calculated, violent spins. There was the shattering of glass, the groaning of twisted metal, and the sickening jolt as the vehicle came to a rest, a crumpled monument to a fabricated tragedy. Arthur was unharmed, protected by the car's advanced safety features and the meticulous engineering of his team. But he lay motionless, his body a silent, still weight, playing the part of a man whose life had just been irrevocably broken. The sirens were a distant, approaching wail, growing louder with every passing second. The next few hours were a blur of sterile white rooms and the low murmurs of doctors and nurses. He was in a private wing of a hospital he himself had funded, the perfect stage for his performance. His doctor, a man named Dr. Evans, who was a part of the plan, stood by his bed, his face a mask of practiced concern. "He's lucky to be alive," the doctor said to the nurses in the hall, his voice clear and professional. "But the trauma, the severe spinal damage, we can't be sure if he'll ever walk again." The words were a calculated dagger, Delivered with surgical precision, designed to be overheard and repeated, Arthur lay there, his gaze fixed on the ceiling, a silent prisoner in his own mind. He could feel his legs, his arms, every part of his body screaming with the unnatural stillness he had forced upon it. This was his new reality. He was a man who had chosen to be broken, to become a helpless pawn in his own elaborate game. The news of his tragic accident and the subsequent catastrophic financial losses he had suffered were already spreading like wildfire across the globe. The stage was set, the curtain was raised, and the audience, the world and Victoria, was about to take their seats. The hospital room became Arthur's gilded cage. He lay motionless, a prisoner of his own making, watching the world unfold through a haze of medical silence and the soft glow of a television screen that showed his face on every news channel. The headlines screamed of a tragic accident and a corporate meltdown, fabricating a narrative of a man who had lost his empire in a single, catastrophic blow. He was no longer the all-powerful Arthur Sterling. He was a spectacle, a cautionary tale, and he was waiting. Then the door swung open and Victoria entered, a whirlwind of dramatic sorrow and expensive perfume. Her face was a perfect mask of grief, her eyes wide with what he knew was feigned terror. She rushed to his side, her voice a practiced whisper. "Arthur, my darling, what have they done to you?" "I was so worried." He could feel the calculated touch of her fingers on his arm, a performance for the nurses and for his own benefit. The show had begun. For a brief, tense moment she maintained the illusion, but it was the whispered conversation she had with his supposed financial manager in the hall that shattered her performance. She returned to his bedside, her face now a storm of poorly concealed fury. "They said it's all gone, Arthur," she hissed, her voice low and filled with venom. "They said everything, the funds, the accounts, the properties. Are you telling me you're a pauper?" Her voice rose, betraying a sense of entitlement and rage that left no room for compassion. Her tears were no longer for him, but for the life she had just lost. Arthur lay perfectly still, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. This was the moment. This was the truth. Her face, now contorted with greed and contempt, was the reality beneath the mask. There was no longer any doubt. She was not the woman he had hoped for, but a vulture circling a corpse. She left his room in a furious huff, her words a trail of curses. He was left alone once more, his mind now a terrifying void of certainty. He was truly trapped, paralyzed, not by his body, but by the weight of a lie so profound that there was no way back. He had crossed a line, and the life he had known was gone forever. The silence that fell after Victoria's furious exit was a vacuum, cold and absolute. It filled the room, pressing in on Arthur until he felt as though he could no longer breathe. He was alone, utterly, completely, terrifyingly alone. The plan had worked flawlessly. The monster he had suspected was indeed real, revealed in its full grotesque form. He should have felt vindication, a sense of triumph. Instead, he felt only a profound, suffocating emptiness. The truth had set him free from one prison, only to lock him inside another. His mind reeled, replaying Victoria's bitter words. Pauper, the word was a knife twisted in the wound of his self-inflicted helplessness. He had been a king, and now he was a beggar in a bed feigning paralysis. But the paralysis felt real. The weight of his lie was a physical burden, trapping him, making every forced moment of stillness a form of psychological torture. He felt a phantom ache in his legs, a yearning to get up and run, to scream at the world that he was a fool who had traded everything for a painful confirmation of what he already knew. His vast empire meant nothing in this room, where he was just a patient, a body in a bed. A young nurse with gentle eyes and a kind smile entered to check his vitals. She didn't know who he was, didn't know the fortune that was supposedly gone, or the fiancée who had just stormed out. She simply saw a man in a neck brace, a human being who had been through a traumatic event. She adjusted his pillow, her touch soft and professional. "You just rest now, Mr. Sterling," she whispered, her voice a soothing balm. "We'll take good care of you." Her simple compassion, unburdened by greed or pretense, was the first real thing he had encountered in days. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough to make him feel the full, crushing weight of his loneliness. He had sought truth in a world of lies, and now he was a solitary island in a sea of his own making. 2 days bled into one, and Arthur's prison remained absolute. He had seen the last of the fair-weather friends, the business associates who sent flowers with empty cards, the distant relatives who offered platitudes. He was alone, and the crushing weight of that solitude was heavier than any physical paralysis. He was staring at the ceiling, lost in a fog of self-pity, when a soft, hesitant knock sounded at his door. It was not the sharp rap of a nurse, nor the hurried tap of a doctor. It was a gentle invitation. The door opened and Maria entered. She was dressed not in her uniform, but in a simple dress and a quiet coat. There was no pretense in her movements, no dramatic flair. Her face was etched with a genuine concern that was so foreign to him, it felt like a jolt of cold water. "They said you weren't having any visitors," she said softly, her voice a balm to his shattered nerves. "But I saw it on the news. They said you—" "Well, I came to see for myself." She carried a small potted plant, a simple green thing that looked impossibly alive in the sterile white room. She placed it on the windowsill, its verdant leaves a small splash of hope. She didn't ask about his money or his future. She simply pulled up a chair and sat quietly by his bed, her presence a silent offering of comfort. "It doesn't matter what happened," she said, her hands folded in her lap. "What matters is that you're here, and you're safe." Her words were a lifeline in the middle of a storm. He felt a sudden, unexpected urge to speak, to tell her the whole truth, to scream that he wasn't really paralyzed. But he stayed silent, captivated by the sheer, simple purity of her kindness. Her eyes didn't hold the analytical glare of a scavenger. They held the warmth of a true friend. In that moment, Arthur understood. All his money, all his power, all the careful plans he had laid out, none of it mattered. He had been so focused on exposing the ugliness in the world that he had forgotten to look for the good. Maria's quiet presence was a single solitary light in the darkness he had so carefully constructed. The test was over. The lie had served its purpose. He had not only found the truth about Victoria, but he was about to discover an even more profound truth about himself and the world he had abandoned. The gilded cage of the hospital was replaced by the gilded cage of his own mansion. Arthur's home, once a monument to his power, now felt like a tomb. The air was stale, heavy with the silent echoes of a life that was gone forever. He spent his days in a wheelchair, a silent observer in his own domain. The world he had once commanded from his office now felt impossibly distant, a television screen showing a reality he no longer inhabited. The silence of his days was only broken by the hushed whispers of staff, who treated him with a mix of pity and professional detachment. He was a patient, not a king. A few weeks after his return, Victoria made her first appearance. She arrived in a flurry of activity, her voice a practiced melody of sorrow and concern. "Oh, Arthur, darling, look at you," she cooed, her eyes scanning the opulent living room, assessing the value of what remained. She brought a small, tasteful box of chocolates, a token of affection, as hollow as her words. She sat gracefully on the edge of the sofa, her face a mask of grief, but her questions were knives, carefully probing for weakness. Have you heard anything about the legal battle? Is there any chance of recovering? Anything?" She spoke of his fortune like a lost pet, her voice laced with a subtle, sickening hope that a miracle would occur, and her inheritance would be restored. But in the quiet moments after Victoria's departure, a different presence filled the space. Maria, his housekeeper, was a constant, gentle force. She moved through the house with a quiet purpose, her hands always busy, her eyes always kind. She never spoke of his money or his past glory. She simply brought him a cup of tea, a fresh blanket, a magazine with an article on a topic she thought he might enjoy. She would stand by him in silence, her presence a silent offering of genuine, human kindness. Where Victoria's pity was a performance, Maria's care was an instinct. She saw not a broken billionaire, but a man in pain, and her simple gestures were a stark and beautiful contrast to the hollowness of his old life. The veneer of Victoria's pity was cracking. Her visits became less frequent, her calls less sorrowful. When she did come, her impatience hung in the air like a thick, unpleasant fog. One afternoon, she entered his living room without her usual theatrical flourish, her face set in a scowl. She paced the polished marble floors, her high heels clicking a restless, angry rhythm. "I can't keep this up, Arthur," she spat, her voice tight with resentment. "My friends are talking. They're asking why I'm still here, tending to a sick man." The last words were spoken with a palpable disgust. She wasn't his fiancée. She was his captor, and he was a burden. He watched her from his wheelchair, a silent judge in his own courtroom. She complained about the inconvenience of his condition, about having to turn down invitations to exclusive parties and explain her circumstances. She spoke of her sacrifice, of the ruined social standing that came with being engaged to a man who had lost his fortune and his mobility. She didn't see a man who had chosen to be broken. She saw a worthless object, a broken toy. The lie, he thought with a cold satisfaction, had done its job. It had revealed every ugly inch of her soul. Her final act was to stand over him, her shadow falling over his still form. "I'm sorry, Arthur," she said, her voice devoid of any real emotion. "I just can't do this anymore. You need to understand." She turned and left without a backward glance, leaving a chilling silence in her wake. He was alone again, the echoes of her cruelty hanging in the air. A few minutes later, the gentle hum of a vacuum cleaner grew closer. Maria came into the room, her eyes cast downward as she went about her work. She saw him sitting motionless, his gaze fixed on the empty space where Victoria had stood. Without a word, she turned off the vacuum, its drone a harsh sound in the quiet room. She walked over to him and gently placed a small, warm mug in his hand. "Chamomile," she said softly. "It helps." He looked up at her kind, tired eyes, and saw a warmth there that had nothing to do with money or status. She saw his pain, not his power, and in that simple gesture, she had once again saved him from the coldness of the world he had created. The air in the mansion, once thick with the poison of deceit, began to clear. In the days that followed Victoria's final, cutting departure, a quiet and profound change took hold. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the soft rustle of Maria's movements and the gentle hum of her presence. She had taken on the role of his primary caregiver with a grace and ease that felt impossibly natural. She would adjust his pillows, help him with his meals, and in the late afternoons she would tend to the small plant she had brought, its leaves seeming to grow more vibrant with each passing day. It was a shared, silent ritual that spoke more than 100 of Victoria's carefully rehearsed speeches ever could. One evening, as she was helping him adjust a blanket, Arthur spoke for the first time without a hidden agenda. His voice was a little rough from disuse, but it was filled with genuine curiosity. "Maria," he said softly, his gaze finally meeting hers, "why do you stay?" She paused, her hands still, and her smile was a thing of profound sadness and warmth. "It's my job, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice gentle, "but it's more than that. It's what we do. We help each other. It's what people do." Her words were so simple, so free of the complex layers of his old life, that they resonated deep within him. He had spent his entire life building walls, and she was simply knocking them down with a single truthful statement. He began to ask her about her own life. He learned she had a son, that she worked 2 jobs to send him to a good school, that she loved to garden, and that she found joy in the simple act of helping others. For the first time, the man who knew everything about the world's markets and political landscapes knew nothing about the world of a truly good person. The more she spoke, the more he realized his old life, for all its grandness, was a poverty of the soul. He had been a millionaire in money, but a pauper in humanity. In her quiet strength, he found a sense of peace he had never known. The test was over, but the real journey was just beginning. The days began to blur, no longer marked by the frantic pace of the stock market, but by the quiet rhythm of the rising and setting sun. In this new, confined world, Arthur found himself a witness to a kind of life he had never known. The woman who brought him tea and adjusted his pillow wasn't a subordinate. She was his window to a world of simple, unvarnished grace. He learned the sound of her footsteps, the way her smile reached her eyes, and the quiet dignity with which she carried herself. He was an impostor in a kingdom of his own making, and the queen of it all was a woman he was actively deceiving. A profound and unsettling guilt began to take hold. It was a cold dread that settled in his stomach, a weight heavier than the lie of his paralysis. He would watch her, a silent shadow of remorse, as she moved through his living room, humming a tune or talking to the potted plant she had brought. Her kindness was a mirror, and in it he saw the ugliness of his own grand deception. She had given him her trust completely. Her care was a gift with no strings attached, and he was repaying her with a falsehood. He felt weak, not because of his body, but because of his soul. His lie had become a betrayal. One afternoon, as she helped him sit upright, he almost spoke. The words were on his tongue, a desperate plea for forgiveness. But he looked at her face, so open and trusting, and realized the truth would break her. He would not do that to her. He swallowed the words, the lie a bitter taste in his mouth. Their relationship blossomed in the quiet corners of the house, a fragile, beautiful thing nurtured in the silence. They would spend hours in the sunlit study, Maria reading to him from old books she loved. He had read countless technical journals and financial reports, but her voice reading poetry or an old story was a melody he had never heard. He would find himself laughing, a sound that felt foreign and a little rusty, at a joke she made about his dusty old books or the way the curtains wouldn't close properly. He started to look forward to the afternoons, to the hours when the pretense of his old life was completely gone. He was no longer a billionaire. He was just Arthur, and she was just Maria. The man who had once commanded a world of power and influence was now utterly captivated by a single person's humanity. Her simple kindness was a language he was just learning to speak. He found himself more connected to her than he had ever been to Victoria, to his board members, or to his own family. The wealth he had worked so hard to accumulate had brought him nothing but loneliness, and the lie he had so carefully crafted had gifted him with something he could never have bought, a genuine human connection. His old life felt like a ghost, a hollow, echoing memory. He began to wonder if his paralysis, in a strange, beautiful way, was the best thing that had ever happened to him. The peace he had found was shattered by a ghost from his past. One morning, a sharp, insistent ringing from an old cell phone he had kept hidden in a drawer sliced through the quiet afternoon. It was a lawyer from his firm, a man who believed the lie. Arthur's hands, trembling slightly from disuse and anxiety, fumbled for the phone. "Mr. Sterling?" The voice on the other end said, professional and concerned. "Just a final check-in. The liquidations are complete. It's a clean sweep. We've managed to hide the trail perfectly. You're officially a pauper, sir." The words were meant to be reassuring, a confirmation that his plan had succeeded. But for Arthur, they were a cold jolt of reality. He wasn't a pauper in his mind. He was a man in love with his housekeeper. He felt a sudden, profound fear. The lie that had brought him so much peace was also the sword hanging over his head. What would happen if Maria found out? How could he ever explain his elaborate deception? He had risked his fortune for a truth that had now become a burden, and the more he fell for Maria, the more terrifying his secret became. His old life was a ticking time bomb, and it threatened to blow apart the only real thing he had ever had. The man who had been a titan of industry was now just a man, weak and terrified, trapped by a lie, and haunted by the prospect of losing the one person who truly cared for him. The brief peace that had settled over the mansion was shattered one crisp autumn morning by the jarring sound of the front door opening without a knock. It was Victoria. She was no longer the mournful fiancée from her last visit. Her eyes held a cold, calculating fire. She strode into the living room, her gaze sweeping over the books and plants that had become a sign of a new, quieter life. "I heard a few things, Arthur," she said, her voice a low, dangerous purr. "Rumors about you getting better and about the new housekeeper, who apparently never leaves your side." She looked at Maria, who had just entered the room with a tray of tea, her face a mask of suspicion and contempt. "Is that a pot of tea you're bringing him, or a pot of gold?" Victoria sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "I'm surprised you haven't sold it for your son's college fund." Maria's face remained impassive, her hands steady, a silent wall of dignity against Victoria's aggression. The true villain had returned, not to mourn a lost fortune, but to scavenge the ruins for any last bit of value. She saw Maria not as a person, but as a rival for a man she had already discarded. Her questions were no longer about his well-being, but about the possibility of a hidden fortune, a last-ditch effort to claim what she believed was hers. She was relentless, her words a barrage of insinuations and thinly veiled threats. Her sole purpose to unearth the secret she believed Arthur was hiding. The tension in the room thickened until it was suffocating. Victoria's eyes, burning with a mix of fury and suspicion, darted from Arthur's motionless form to Maria's impassive face. "I don't believe you," she hissed, her voice a low, chilling whisper. "There's something wrong here. You're not this helpless. You're trying to fool me." With a sudden, terrifying surge of energy, she strode over to Arthur's wheelchair and grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his flesh. "Get up, Arthur! Get up!" she screamed, her voice breaking with rage. She tried to pull him from the chair, to force him to his feet. For a terrifying, heart-stopping second, Arthur felt a primal urge to react, to push her away, to defend himself. But he knew the lie had to hold. He remained perfectly still, a silent, unmoving weight in the chair, his face a mask of shock. The terror in his eyes was real, but it wasn't for his safety. It was for Maria's. Without a moment's hesitation, Maria sprang forward, her hands firm but gentle, pulling Victoria's grasping fingers away from Arthur's arm. "Leave him alone," Maria said, her voice surprisingly strong and clear. "He's a sick man. You have no right." Victoria recoiled as if she had been burned, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and fury. She had expected to find a helpless man, and instead she had found a fierce, quiet protector. She looked from Arthur's still form to Maria's determined face, her mind racing. She had found her answer, and it wasn't in a hidden bank account, but in a look in Maria's eyes. Victoria left in a storm of threats and accusations. Her last words a promise to expose the con, but her departure left behind a profound silence, heavier than the one she had broken. Maria stood over Arthur, her breathing still a little ragged, her eyes filled with a concern that was both fierce and tender. She knelt before him, her hands gently taking his. "Are you all right, Mr. Sterling?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Did she hurt you?" Her concern was a balm on his soul, and for the first time he felt a tear escape his eye, running a hot, silent path down his cheek. He shook his head, a single tiny movement. In that moment everything changed. The game was no longer about his revenge against Victoria. It was about protecting Maria. He had put her in danger by allowing her into his world of deception. He had exposed her quiet, simple goodness to the poison of a woman who saw kindness as a weakness to be exploited. He looked into Maria's eyes, and he saw not just her kindness, but a strength that rivaled his own. She was his shield, his protector, the one person who had stood between him and the cold cruelty of the world he had left behind. He was no longer a judge in a courtroom of his own making. He was a man who had been found and protected. The lie had to end, not for his own sake, but for hers. The days began to feel like a dream filled with a quiet rhythm of care and a growing sense of intimacy. He and Maria had a routine now, a shared silence that was more meaningful than any conversation he had ever had in his old life. One evening, as Maria was preparing to leave, she paused by his side, a look of profound sadness in her eyes. "Sometimes," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper, "I look at you and I see my father. Arthur's eyes widened, a silent question. "He was a kind man, a good man," she continued, her voice filled with a quiet ache. "But he had a secret, a sickness, and it kept him from the world. He was a man of great strength, but he was trapped by his own body." Her words were a dagger to Arthur's heart. She saw him not as a billionaire, but as a man suffering, a man trapped by a disease. She was giving him her empathy, her sympathy, her most profound vulnerability, and he was taking it all under false pretenses. He felt a desperate urge to confess, to tell her the whole truth, that he wasn't sick, that he was just a fool who had lost his way. His lips parted, and the words trembled on his tongue. But he looked at her eyes, so filled with a genuine, beautiful sorrow, and he couldn't do it. The truth, he knew, would hurt her more than his lie. It would destroy the one good thing he had. He had to keep pretending. The past, however, was not content to stay in the shadows. One afternoon, a car pulled into his driveway, a sleek black vehicle he knew intimately. Out of it stepped his former rival, a man named Jonathan Vance, a titan of industry with a face as hard and cold as a slab of granite. Vance was a vulture, a man who feasted on weakness. He walked into the living room, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. "I came to pay my respects, Arthur," he said, his voice laced with a bitter triumph. "It seems the great Arthur Sterling has fallen, and I'm here to pick up the pieces." Vance offered him a deal, a small token sum of money for the rights to his old companies, a way to get back on his feet. It was a patronizing, humiliating offer. He was being tempted to return to the world he had left behind, a world of deceit and power, and to give up the quiet, honest life he had found with Maria. He looked from Vance's smug, predatory face to Maria's quiet, watchful one. The choice was clear. With all the inner strength he could muster, he shook his head, a single, firm movement. "No," he said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. "I don't need your charity. I'm exactly where I need to be." He had chosen Maria, and in that moment, he felt a strength he had never known as a billionaire. The mansion had finally become his home, a place of peace, not just a gilded cage. He spent the evening alone with Maria, the last light of the day, casting long shadows across the floor. He watched her as she watered the small potted plant she had brought him, a look of profound concentration on her face. Her care was a quiet, constant presence, a balm to his soul. In her silent world, he had found a kind of truth, a kind of peace, that a lifetime of money and power had never been able to buy. The life he was living now, a life of simple kindness and genuine connection, was more real than any life he had ever known. But the lie, a ghost he had invited into his home, was still there, a constant threat to the fragile peace he had found. He thought of Victoria, of her cold fury, and of Jonathan Vance, of his predatory grin. He had protected Maria from them, but for how long? His secret was a ticking time bomb, and it was only a matter of time before someone, an outsider, would reveal the truth and destroy the one beautiful thing he had. He couldn't let that happen. He had to be the one to tell her. He had to be the one to open the door to his past and invite her in, to trust her with the full, complete truth. "Maria," he said, his voice a low, raspy whisper, a sound that felt foreign from his throat. She turned, a question in her eyes. He had to be strong, not for himself, but for her. This was his last act of courage, his final gamble. He looked at her, his heart a raw, open wound, and for the first time, he saw a future that was no longer about revenge, but about love. He had to be a man worthy of her. He had to confess. "Maria," he repeated, his voice stronger now, filled with a desperate, heartbreaking sincerity. "I have something I need to tell you. It's about me. It's about all of this." He gestured vaguely at his immobile body and the wheelchair. He took a deep breath, his heart thumping in his chest, ready to unleash the words that would either set him free or destroy everything. The silence after Arthur's confession was thick, so heavy with unspoken truths that it felt as if it could crush them both. He watched Maria's face, a roadmap of emotions playing out in her eyes, confusion, then shock, followed by a hurt so profound it took his breath away. You can walk?" she whispered, the words trembling on her lips. You lied all this time. The pain in her voice was 1,000 times more devastating than Victoria's rage. He had hurt the one person who had been truly kind to him. He was a fool, a monster, a liar. He shook his head, the tears he had held back for months now streaming freely down his face. Yes, he said, his voice a raw, choked sound. I lied to everyone, but never to you, not in my heart. The test, it was for Victoria, to see if she loved me or my money. I never meant to deceive you, Maria, I swear. He watched as the initial shock on her face softened, giving way to a new emotion, a dawning of understanding. She looked at his face, at his genuine sorrow, and in her heart she saw not the cunning mind of a billionaire, but the broken soul of a man who had been searching for truth. She took his hand, her touch as gentle and firm as always. I understand, she said, her voice filled with a grace he didn't deserve. With her hand in his, a final surge of strength, of freedom washed over him. The lie had run its course. The prison was finally gone. He took a deep breath, a man reborn, and slowly, carefully, he pushed himself up. His muscles screamed with the effort, but he stood. He was whole again. He was free. He looked down at Maria, a silent testament to the lie, and in her eyes he saw not just forgiveness, but a new kind of love. The day of reckoning arrived without warning. It was a week after Arthur's confession to Maria. They were in the living room, reading in comfortable silence, a new kind of peace having settled between them. A car pulled up to the house, and out of it stepped Victoria, her face a mask of determined righteousness, a lawyer by her side. She hadn't come to grieve. She had come to collect. Arthur, she said, her voice a practiced melody of false concern. I'm here to finalize our separation. My lawyer and I feel that considering my emotional turmoil and your condition, a settlement is only fair. She was a creature of entitlement, a vulture circling a corpse that was not yet cold. She didn't even acknowledge Maria, who stood silently by Arthur's side, her hand resting on his shoulder. Arthur looked from Victoria's cold, predatory gaze to Maria's fierce, protective one. The time for games was over. The time for truth had come. He took a deep breath, and for the first time in months, he spoke with the full, commanding force of a man who had once ruled the world. There will be no settlement, Victoria, he said, his voice a low, chilling rumble. You see, my condition is about to change. For a single breathless second, Victoria and her lawyer simply stared at him, their faces frozen in confusion. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, Arthur pushed himself out of his wheelchair. He stood, a man once broken, now whole. He straightened his back, his eyes fixed on Victoria's, watching as the realization dawned on her face. Her jaw went slack, her eyes wide with shock and pure, unadulterated fury. What is this?" she hissed, her voice a strangled whisper. "This is a trick." "It was a test, Victoria," Arthur said, his voice now strong and clear. "And you failed, miserably." He gestured to Maria, who was standing beside him. "This woman here," he said, "is the one person who saw my worth when I was supposed to have nothing. She stayed. You left. You who came for my money were defeated by a woman who came for my heart." With a single nod, a trusted associate and a team of lawyers entered the room. "The financial reports were also a lie," his associate said calmly, his voice cold and professional. "Mr. Sterling's assets have doubled since his supposed accident. He is more powerful than ever." The color drained from Victoria's face. She was exposed, humiliated, and utterly defeated. The villain was finally vanquished, her defeat total and absolute. The mansion, which had so recently been a stage for deceit and cruelty, was now a sanctuary of peace. After Victoria's humiliating departure, a profound silence fell, a silence that felt not empty, but full. Arthur turned from the front door, his heart still thrumming with the adrenaline of the confrontation, and looked at Maria. She was standing a few feet away, her face a mixture of awe and relief. The man she had known as a helpless invalid was now standing tall, his eyes clear and his posture straight. He was no longer a patient. He was a man in love. He walked toward her, each step a testament to his freedom. He reached out and took her hands in his touch firm and sure. "Maria," he said, his voice raw with emotion, "you saw the truth in me when I was still living a lie. You saw my worth not in my money, but in my soul. I gave you nothing but a broken man, and you gave me everything. You gave me a reason to fight, a reason to live." The words he had kept bottled up for months came pouring out, a torrent of gratitude and profound, overwhelming love. "I wasn't looking for a caretaker," he continued. "I was looking for a partner. I was looking for a woman who could see me, truly see me, and accept me for who I was." He led her to a chair and gently helped her sit. He then knelt before her, the man who had commanded a world, now humbling himself before the one person who truly mattered. "The money is all still there," he said softly, looking up into her eyes. "My fortune is intact, and it's all because of you. It's a testament to the person you are. But I've learned that all the money in the world can't buy what you gave me. I want to give you a choice, Maria, not just a reward. A partnership, a life. I want to spend the rest of my days learning from you, loving you, and making sure that the world knows that the true hero in this story is you." The story of Arthur Sterling is not about a billionaire who won. It is the story of a man who chose to lose it all to find his way back to himself. In a world obsessed with wealth and status, he was a king who abdicated his throne to live among the people he had ignored. He built a trap to catch a fraud, and in doing so, he became the victim of his own grand design. But the prison he built for himself became his salvation. He was forced to become a man with nothing, and in his newfound poverty, he discovered the greatest riches of all. His story is a powerful reminder that our greatest fears often hold our greatest lessons. Arthur feared that no one would love him for himself, and he created a lie so profound that it revealed the deepest, darkest parts of the people around him. But in the midst of that darkness, a single light shone through. The woman he thought was a servant became his savior. She didn't see his money, his power, or his prestige. She saw a man in pain, and she offered him a kindness so pure, so absolute, that it healed his soul. She was the hero of his story, and in her quiet strength he found his own. The truth is, we are all on a journey to find ourselves. We build walls of pride, of wealth, of success, of ego, believing that they will protect us. But in reality, they only imprison us. True freedom is found in our vulnerability, in our ability to trust, to love, and to be loved for who we are, not for what we have. Arthur Sterling's triumph wasn't in regaining his fortune. It was in realizing that he was already rich beyond measure. His triumph was in finding true love, a bond forged not in wealth but in kindness. Months passed, and the echoes of the scandal faded, replaced by a quiet, beautiful life. Arthur and Maria's love story became a secret they shared, a testament to a bond forged in the most unlikely of circumstances. They did not live a life of grand extravagance. Instead, they built a life of shared moments, of quiet walks in the garden, of shared meals, of laughter that was genuine and free. Arthur had never truly seen the world he lived in, but now he saw it all through Maria's eyes. He had found a partner, a friend, and a love that was real. The man who had once been a titan of industry now spent his days focused on ventures of a different kind, foundations for children in need, charities for the underprivileged, and a private, quiet life where the only measure of success was the amount of happiness he could share with the woman he loved. He had found a new purpose, a new way to live. The man who had been a prisoner of his own lies was now a beacon of hope, and a testament to the fact that the greatest triumph is not in conquering the world, but in conquering ourselves. The life he had so carefully crafted had turned out to be a lie. But the one he had built with Maria was the beautiful, honest, and truly triumphant life he had been searching for all along. The fear of Victoria's return was a constant, low-level hum of anxiety, but the true struggle was a private war waged within the quiet walls of his home. It was a war against his own body. His muscles ached with the desire to move, to stretch, to stand. He was a man accustomed to control, and this lack of it, even self-imposed, was a form of torture. One afternoon, Maria had left the room to answer the door, and for a brief, fleeting moment Arthur was completely alone. On a table a few feet away, a book he was halfway through was lying open, and a cup of tea, still steaming, stood beside it. His hands, though still and lifeless to the outside world, trembled with a desperate, silent yearning to reach out and touch it. The lie was so ingrained in him that his body no longer seemed to listen to his mind. He was a perfect actor in his own private drama. He was a man who had chosen to be helpless, and now the choice was becoming a reality. He could feel the strength in his limbs, the power waiting to be unleashed, but he had to hold it back, to maintain the facade. The psychological toll was immense. He was a fortress with a secret door, and he was terrified that one day his body would betray his mind. This wasn't about Victoria or his money. It was about the simple, profound loneliness of being an imposter in his own skin.